The courtroom was packed, every seat occupied, every breath held in anticipation. The air inside the Austin County Courthouse was thick, not just with the weight of a sweltering Texas summer, but with the gravity of the decision about to be made. At the center of it all sat Judge Harrison Cole, a man whose reputation carried as much weight as the gavel he wielded. At 61 with 30 years on the bench, he had built his career on the principles of swift justice, unwavering discipline, and a firm belief in the law. Mercy was not his brand. If a man was found guilty, Cole believed, then the system had spoken. And today, it spoke again. Mr. Carter. Judge Cole's voice echoed through the silent room, his baritone calm but firm. You stand convicted by a jury of your peers for crimes that have brought irreparable harm to this community. Armed robbery, assault with a deadly weapon, reckless endangerment. The evidence against you has been overwhelming, and you have shown no remorse. At the defense table, Ethan Carter, just 25 years old, stood frozen. His hands trembled slightly, but his gaze remained steady. His face, weathered beyond his years, wore the look of a man who had spent a lifetime trying to prove himself. But today, no words, no pleas, no last-minute revelations would save him. In the back row, Linda Carter, Ethan's mother, stifled a sob. She had begged the court to see him as more than just a case number. She had spoken of the son she raised, the boy who had dreamed of being a firefighter, who worked late shifts at a truck stop to make ends meet. But none of it mattered. The evidence had spoken louder. A grainy surveillance video showed a man of similar build fleeing Hudson Bank with $120 in cash stuffed into a duffel bag. Witnesses swore they had heard Ethan's voice. A fingerprint, his fingerprint, had been found on a gun discarded near the scene. And the final blow? An anonymous tip that led officers straight to a storage unit under his name, where they found bundles of marked bills. Judge Cole exhaled slowly, then lifted the gavel. I hereby sentence you to 55 years in state prison. The gavel struck the oak block with a force that felt final, absolute. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. A few cheers from the victim's family, the scribbling of reporters' pens. But for Ethan Carter, the world had gone silent. As the bailiff approached, he turned once, just once, to look at his mother. Tears streaked down her face as she shook her head in disbelief. Then the chains tightened around his wrists, and he was led away. Judge Cole pushed himself back from the bench, retreating to his chambers. He poured a cup of black coffee, staring into the swirling liquid as if it held answers. He had done his duty. He had followed the law. But as the echo of the gavel faded, a faint flicker of unease settled deep within him. He dismissed it as fatigue. Little did he know, the truth he had just buried would soon claw its way to the surface, refusing to stay hidden. Judge Harrison Cole was no stranger to late nights. His study at home, lined with old case files, legal texts, and a single framed photo of his late wife, was his refuge after long days in court. It was where he retreated when the weight of the gavel grew too heavy. But tonight was different. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, but sleep was a distant thought. He sat at his desk, a steaming cup of black coffee in hand, flipping through documents for an upcoming case involving allegations of police misconduct. That was when it happened. At first, it was nothing, just another evidence log buried in the stack of reports. But something made him pause. A name leaped off the page: Ethan Carter. Judge Cole frowned, flipping to the next page, his pulse quickening. Why was Ethan's name appearing in a separate police investigation? He traced his finger down the log entries until it landed on a single, damning detail. A .45 caliber handgun, same make and model as the one used in the Hudson Bank robbery, had been recovered from a separate crime scene just 2 days after Ethan's arrest. Cole sat back, heart pounding. That can't be right. This gun, the very weapon tied to Ethan's conviction, had been in police custody before the trial even began. But that wasn't possible, because that same gun had been presented in court as the murder weapon. His breath came slower now, measured, as his mind turned over the implications. He pulled Ethan's case file from his drawer, flipping straight to the forensic reports. The serial number on the gun, a tiny engraving etched near the trigger guard, matched the one listed in this unrelated case. His grip tightened on the paper. If this was true, then Ethan Carter had been convicted on a lie. The weight of realization settled heavy on his chest. The gun in evidence couldn't have been used in the Hudson Bank robbery, It had already been in police possession, which meant someone had planted Ethan's fingerprints on a gun he had never touched. Judge Cole felt something cold creep up his spine. This wasn't just a mistake. It was deliberate. He grabbed a pen, flipping through pages with urgency now, cross-referencing police reports, arrest logs, chain of custody records. The deeper he dug, the more the threads began to unravel. The anonymous tip that led to Ethan's arrest? The number traced back to a burner phone one purchased near the precinct just days before the robbery. The lead detective on the case, Detective Martin Graves, had also been listed in the investigation of this second crime, the one where the gun had originally been confiscated. The evidence wasn't just flawed, it had been manipulated. Judge Cole's grip tightened around the paper in his hands. He had sent an innocent man to prison for 55 years. His throat went dry. He had built his career on the belief that justice was blind, that his law was absolute. But now, staring at the cold, hard facts in front of him, he realized something far worse than simply making a mistake. He had been used. Someone had orchestrated this. Someone powerful. Someone willing to bury the truth to protect themselves. Cole closed the file, his jaw tight. He had spent decades sentencing men who thought they could outsmart the system. And now? He was standing in the wreckage of a system that had outsmarted him. For the first time in years, he didn't know what to do. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his phone. There was only one person he could trust with something like this. An old name, an old friend. Frank Delaney. It was well past 2 a.m. when Frank Delaney picked up. His voice was hoarse, thick with sleep. "Cole? You better have a damn good reason for calling me at this hour. I need your help, Frank." A long silence. Then the sound of rustling sheets as the retired investigator sat up. "What kind of help?" Cole hesitated, then said the words out loud for the first time. "I think I sent an innocent man to prison." Silence again. Then Frank let out a slow, measured breath. "Where do we start?" Cole exhaled. He hadn't realized he was holding his breath. "With the truth," he said. "No matter where it takes us." He had sentenced Ethan Carter to 55 years. But now, Cole would do whatever it took to make things right, even if it meant tearing the system apart to do it. Frank Delaney wasn't the kind of man to scare easily. A former investigator with over 25 years in law enforcement, he had seen enough corruption, enough buried cases, enough backroom deals to know when something didn't add up. And this? This was worse than anything he'd come across. Sitting across from Judge Harrison Cole, at a dimly lit diner just off Highway 290. He listened intently as Cole laid out everything: the gun, the anonymous tip, the mismatched evidence logs. It was a tangled mess of contradictions that pointed to one chilling conclusion. Ethan Carter had been framed. Frank took a slow sip of his coffee, setting the mug down with a quiet clink. His eyes, sharp despite the years, studied Cole carefully. "If what you're saying is true, this isn't just negligence, Harrison. This is a setup. Someone went to great lengths to make sure that kid took the fall." Cole nodded grimly. "I need proof, Frank. Solid proof. If I go public with this without it." He didn't need to finish. His entire career, his entire life's work would be torn apart. Frank leaned back, crossing his arms. "Then we dig. Quietly." And so, the investigation began. Unraveling the lies. The first crack in the wall came with the anonymous tip, the call that had led the police straight to Ethan Carter's doorstep. Frank had a contact, a guy still inside the department, working cybercrimes, who owed him a favor. Within hours, the records came back. The call hadn't come from a random citizen. It had been made from a burner phone, purchased just days before Ethan's arrest. And the kicker? The purchase was traced to a credit card registered to Detective Martin Graves. Cole's stomach churned. Graves had been the lead detective on Ethan's case, the man who had testified under oath that the evidence was airtight. The same man whose name kept popping up in every dirty corner of this case. But that was only the beginning. Frank managed to get his hands on the original witness statements before they were corrected for trial. One stood out. David Langley, a bank teller who had originally identified another man as the suspect. Cole tapped the report with his pen. In court, Langley swore it was Ethan. But here? He wasn't so sure. Frank grunted. "I'll find him." A witness comes clean. Tracking down David Langley wasn't easy. He had left his job at Hudson Bank just weeks after the trial. But Frank had spent years hunting people who didn't want to be found. And 3 days later, he and Cole were knocking on Langley's front door in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The man who answered was nervous. His hands twitched. His eyes darted past them, as if checking for someone watching. I already testified, he stammered, gripping the doorframe. Frank didn't flinch. Yeah, you did. And you changed your story. Langley swallowed hard. I was mistaken before. But in court, Cole cut in, his voice calm but firm. Did someone tell you to change your story? Langley hesitated. Too long. Frank took a step closer. Was it Graves? The color drained from Langley's face. His fingers tightened around the doorknob. That was all the answer they needed. Langley had been pressured. Maybe threatened. Maybe bribed. But it didn't matter. His testimony had been manipulated. And now, they had a witness who could put Graves at the center of it all. The missing surveillance footage, but even with Langley's confession, they needed more. Something undeniable. That's when Frank's contact came through with a bombshell. During the trial, the prosecution had presented one surveillance video from a single angle inside the bank. It showed a masked gunman, roughly Ethan's build, moving quickly through the lobby. But there had been other cameras. And one of those cameras, a security feed from a parking lot near the bank, had never been submitted in court. Frank got his hands on it. And what they found changed everything. The moment of truth, the footage was grainy, but clear enough. It showed a man matching Ethan's general height and build, dressed similarly to the suspect in the bank footage. But then, he turned. Cole's breath caught in his throat. The man's face wasn't visible, but his posture, his movements, they didn't match Ethan at all. And then, something even worse. As the man hurried toward a car, a black SUV parked at the edge of the lot, another figure appeared. A man in a dark suit, a police badge clipped to his belt. Detective Martin Graves. They watched in stunned silence as Graves held the car door open, letting the suspect inside before driving off. The implications were staggering. Graves had been at the scene of the crime. He had interacted with the real suspect. And somehow, the footage had never been used in court. Cole rubbed a hand over his face. This isn't just framing a guy for a crime he didn't commit. He looked at Frank, his expression dark. This was planned. Frank exhaled sharply. This is bigger than we thought. Someone had orchestrated this. And Graves wasn't working alone. A dangerous decision. They had enough now. Enough to shake the foundation of the case. Enough to reopen Ethan's conviction. But Cole wasn't naive. Exposing this wouldn't just threaten his career. It would make him a target. Graves had allies. Inside the department. Inside the district attorney's office. Maybe even higher. If we take this to court, we're putting a target on our backs, Frank warned. Cole looked down at the files spread across the table. A young man sat in prison for a crime he didn't commit. And the people responsible were still out there, untouchable. For now. Cole set his jaw. Then we go public. Frank studied him. Then he nodded. Damn right we do. They had lit the fuse. And now? The explosion was coming. Judge Harrison Cole had spent his career believing that the law was the great equalizer, that no matter how flawed the system was, justice would prevail. But now, staring at the undeniable truth laid out before him, he realized justice wasn't blind, it had been hijacked. And the people behind it? They weren't just careless, they were dangerous. The first warning, it started with a phone call at 3:17 a.m. Cole was sitting in his study, papers spread across his desk, his mind racing with the implications of what he and Frank Delaney had uncovered. Ethan Carter was innocent. The real suspect had been protected. And Detective Martin Graves wasn't just dirty, he was a puppet in a much larger scheme. The phone rang, shattering the silence. He picked up. No one spoke. Just heavy breathing. Deliberate. Calculated. Then, a low voice, "You don't want to do this, Judge." Click. Cole sat there, gripping the receiver, his heart hammering. The message was clear. Back off. Or else. The escalation by sunrise, the threats became bolder. Frank Delaney woke up to find his front door slightly ajar. Inside, nothing was stolen, no money, no valuables. But on his kitchen counter sat a single manila envelope. Inside were printed photos of Frank's daughter, Michelle, walking to her car, shopping for groceries, sitting at a coffee shop. On the back of one, written in red ink, "Leave it alone." Frank's blood ran cold. He called Cole immediately. "They know we're digging." His voice was low, tight with anger. "And they're not just threatening us anymore. They're coming after our families." Cole's grip on his coffee mug tightened. He had always known this fight would be dangerous. But now? Now it was personal. The framed judge that afternoon. Cole arrived at the courthouse to find reporters swarming the steps. Cameras flashed, microphones shoved toward him. "Judge Cole, do you have any response to the bribery allegations?" He stopped in his tracks. "Bribery?" A reporter waved a copy of the morning's headline, "Corruption at the Bench. Judge Harrison Cole under investigation for accepting payments in criminal trials." His stomach lurched. This was a setup. Cole grabbed the newspaper, scanning the article. Anonymous sources. Falsified documents showing fake bank transfers. It was a hit piece, designed to discredit him before he could go public. Frank's words from the night before echoed in his mind. Graves isn't working alone. Whoever was pulling the strings had powerful influence. Cole exhaled sharply and kept walking, pushing through the cameras. He wasn't going to waste his breath denying false claims. If they were willing to go this far to silence him, it only meant one thing. He was getting close to the truth. A line in the sand that night, Frank Delaney stood in Cole's kitchen, gripping a glass of whiskey. He had seen men like this before, the ones who thought they were untouchable. "We have enough to expose them," Frank said. "But if we don't do this the right way, they'll bury us before we get the chance." Cole nodded. He had spent his career upholding the system, believing in its integrity. But now, he was at war with it. He pulled out a file, the evidence they had collected. The gun discrepancies, the surveillance footage, the coerced witness testimony, the falsified police reports. It was damning. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. "We need more," Cole said. "We need a smoking gun." Frank set his glass down. "Then we get it." Breaking the chain, the key was Detective Martin Graves. If Graves had been at the scene with the real suspect, he knew the truth. But he had too much to lose. He would never talk, not unless they forced him to. Frank made some calls. Old favors. Friends who still had access to police records. By morning, they had something. A lead. A name that had appeared in multiple closed-door cases tied to Graves. Lieutenant Raymond Burke. A man known for making problems disappear. A man with deep connections to the district attorney's office. If they could tie Burke to this case, they wouldn't just expose Graves, they'd expose the entire operation. Cole's jaw tightened. This was the moment. The line between backing down and fighting back. He looked at Frank. "If we do this, there's no turning back." Frank nodded. "Then we don't turn back." The decision that changed everything. Cole sat at his desk, staring at his reflection in the window. The threats, the bribery accusations, the power behind it all. He had spent his life believing in the law. But now, he was seeing it for what it really was, a tool wielded by those who knew how to manipulate it. But if they thought a few threats would stop him, they had underestimated him. Cole picked up his phone, dialing a number he hadn't used in years. A deep voice answered. "This is U.S. Attorney Daniel Morris." Cole took a deep breath. "I need to talk to you about a case." "Off the record." A pause. Then, "I'm listening." Cole closed his eyes for a brief moment. Then he made the choice that would change everything. He was going all in. The courtroom was electric, charged with tension so thick it felt like the air had weight. Every seat was filled with reporters, legal analysts, law students, and members of the public who had followed the case with a morbid fascination. They all knew something big was coming. At the front, Judge Harrison Cole took his seat, his expression unreadable. But inside, his pulse was steady, his mind sharp. This was the moment. The point of no return. He cast a quick glance at the defense table, where Ethan Carter sat in his prison jumpsuit. The young man looked different now, thinner, older, his eyes no longer carrying the desperate hope of an innocent man fighting for his life. Instead, there was a quiet, weary resignation. But Cole knew better. By the time today was over, Ethan would either walk out of this courtroom a free man, or the system would prove itself beyond redemption. The opening salvo. The district attorney, Michael Trent, stood first. A polished man, confident, with the slick assurance of someone who had never lost control of a courtroom. "Your Honor, This motion is nothing more than an attempt to undermine a verdict already upheld by this court. The evidence against Mr. Carter remains overwhelming, and we see no grounds for this hearing. Cole let the words hang in the air for a beat. Then he leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. Then you shouldn't have any reason to be worried, Mr. Trent. The DA's jaw tightened. Cole turned his attention to Frank Delaney, who stood at the witness stand. Mr. Delaney, please state your credentials for the court. Frank cleared his throat. Frank Delaney, retired investigator. 25 years in law enforcement. Specialized in fraud and corruption cases. And what did you find during your independent investigation into the conviction of Ethan Carter? Frank reached into a manila folder, pulling out a printed call log. The anonymous tip that led to Carter's arrest, he said, holding it up. This came from a prepaid burner phone. That phone was purchased with a credit card belonging to Detective Martin Graves. A murmur swept through the room. The DA shifted uncomfortably in his seat. That's circumstantial. I'm not finished. Frank flipped to the next page, revealing a copy of an evidence log. This is the record of a .45 caliber handgun seized in a separate case 2 days after the Hudson Bank robbery. Cole nodded. What's significant about this weapon? Frank met his gaze. It's the same gun that was entered into evidence in Carter's trial. A gasp rippled through the spectators. Cole saw Trent's face go pale. So to be clear, Cole continued, this means that the weapon allegedly used in the bank robbery was already in police custody before the crime even occurred. Frank nodded. That's exactly what it means, Your Honor. The crumbling facade to Trent stood quickly, his voice sharp. Objection. This is hearsay. There is no proof. Oh, but there is. This time, it wasn't Frank who spoke. It was David Langley, the former bank teller, the key witness who had testified against Ethan Carter. He stepped up to the stand, gripping the rail tightly, his knuckles white. His voice trembled, but his words were clear. I lied. Dead silence. Cole didn't even look at the DA. He was watching the jury, watching how their faces shifted from doubt to realization. Mr. Langley, Cole said, his tone gentle but firm, tell us what happened. Langley took a shaky breath. Detective Graves came to me before the trial. He told me if I didn't testify against Carter, I'd be arrested for obstruction. I was scared. The room erupted. This was it. The first real crack in the foundation of their case. The final blow to Trent was losing control. His argument had unraveled, and now, his star witness had just admitted to lying under oath. But Cole wasn't done. He turned back to Frank. Mr. Delaney, do you have anything else for the court? Frank nodded. One last thing. He walked over to the evidence table and pulled out a flash drive. Cole took it, turning to the bailiff. Play the file. The screen at the front of the courtroom flickered on. A grainy security camera feed appeared. And there, clear as day, stood Detective Martin Graves. Not at the police station. Not in court. But at the scene of the crime, helping the real suspect escape. The video showed him holding open the door of an unmarked black SUV, allowing a man dressed identically to the robber to slip inside before speeding off. The courtroom exploded. Reporters scrambled, cameras flashed, voices clashed over each other. And the day? He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on a sinking ship. The verdict, that changed everything, it took less than an hour for the judge presiding over the hearing to make his decision. Ethan Carter's conviction, overturned. Detective Martin Graves, arrested before he could even leave the courthouse. A full-scale federal investigation was now underway, and suddenly, every case Graves had ever touched was being re-examined. As the gavel fell, Ethan sat motionless, as if his brain couldn't process what had just happened. Then he turned to see his mother, tears streaming down her face. And finally, after everything, he smiled. Cole let out a slow breath. Justice had been served. But as he looked over at the DA, who was already making hushed phone calls, his gut told him one thing. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The dust had barely settled in the courtroom when the storm began. Judge Harrison Cole watched as the bailiffs escorted Detective Martin Graves out in handcuffs. The once proud officer, who had strutted through courtrooms as if he owned them, now looked like a man whose world had collapsed. The cameras captured every second of his downfall. Reporters scrambling to get the perfect shot. But Cole knew better than to celebrate. This wasn't over. Not for Ethan Carter. And certainly not for the system that had let this happen in the first place. The fallout begins. The morning after the verdict, the headlines exploded across every major news outlet. Corrupt COP exposed in wrongful conviction case. Ethan Carter exonerated after 4 years behind bars. Judge Cole defies the system. Calls for justice reform. Cole's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Some calls were from supporters, civil rights groups, legal advocates, even other judges who quietly admitted they had seen similar patterns but never had the courage to speak out. Other calls were not so friendly. Threats came in the form of anonymous voicemails. Heavy breathing, low voices muttering warnings. Some simply said, "You should have stayed out of this." One message was different. It was a recording of a single gunshot. Cole sat in his office, gripping the phone, his jaw clenched. They weren't just angry. They were afraid. Because if he had cracked one case, how many more would follow? Ethan Carter, a free man, but not whole for Ethan. Freedom didn't feel real at first. His first night outside of prison, he sat in his childhood home, a house that now felt like a relic of another life. His mother, Linda, made him his favorite meal, chicken fried steak with mashed potatoes, but he could barely eat. Too many nights of prison food. Too many years of staring at the same four walls. Even sleep wasn't the escape it should have been. When he finally dozed off, he woke up gripping his mattress as if it were a prison cot, expecting the cold concrete floor beneath him. He was free, but the scars were deeper than he'd realized. And worst of all, the men who had done this to him weren't the only ones. Judge Cole takes a stand 1 week after the trial. Judge Cole made a decision. He could walk away. He had done his part, fought the fight, and won. But if he did, nothing would change. So instead, he called a press conference. In front of a sea of reporters, he did what no sitting judge had done in years. He called for a full investigation into the justice system itself. The conviction of Ethan Carter was not a mistake. It was deliberate. It was planned. And I refuse to believe this was the only case. Gasps. Whispers. The flash of cameras. Cole took a breath, then delivered the final blow. "I am calling for an independent review of all cases linked to Detective Martin Graves and Lieutenant Raymond Burke. The system is meant to serve justice, not power, and I will not stand by while innocent people pay the price." The system fights back. The backlash was swift. Government officials, the police union, even some of Cole's own colleagues. They called him a traitor, said he was trying to tear down the system from the inside. They tried to silence him. The judicial board launched an ethics investigation into his conduct. Anonymous sources accused him of overstepping his role as a judge. Some even whispered about removing him from the bench. But Cole didn't flinch. He had spent years upholding the system. Now, he was ready to fix it. The unexpected twist one evening. As Cole reviewed court documents in his office, Frank Delaney walked in, his face unreadable. Cole looked up. "What is it?" Frank closed the door behind him, setting down a folder. "It's not just Graves and Burke." Cole frowned, flipping open the file. His eyes scanned the names. And then his breath caught. These weren't just dirty cops. These were judges, prosecutors, high-ranking officials. The corruption went deeper than they had imagined. Cole exhaled slowly, pressing his fingers to his temples. They had uncovered something much bigger. And now, they weren't just exposing one case. They were going after the whole damn system. Ethan's next chapter. Ethan Carter could have disappeared. No one would have blamed him. But instead, he stood beside Judge Cole at the next hearing. When asked what he planned to do now that he was free, he looked straight into the cameras and said, "I'm going to help others like me." And with that, he became the face of wrongful conviction reform. A man who had lost 4 years of his life, but refused to let others suffer the same fate. The fight continues. The battle was far from over. Cole knew that exposing corruption didn't mean erasing it overnight. There would be more trials, more danger, more people trying to shut him down. But as he looked at Ethan, standing tall despite everything, he knew one thing: they had already won the first fight. And now? They were just getting started. The final message. As the screen fades to black, a message appears. If this story moved you, consider supporting organizations that fight for the wrongfully convicted. Justice isn't just about punishment, it's about truth. And sometimes, the real fight begins after the verdict is read. Subscribe for more stories that challenge the way we see the world. Because justice isn't guaranteed. It's fought for. Justice is not guaranteed, it is fought for. The story of Judge Harrison Cole and Ethan Carter reminds us that the legal system, like any institution, is only as strong as the people who hold it accountable. Mistakes happen, but when those mistakes are deliberate, when corruption and power overshadow the truth, it takes courage to stand up and demand change. For those who have lived through decades of social and political change, this lesson is not new. We have seen moments in history where the fight for justice was met with resistance, where speaking the truth came at a cost. But we have also seen that change is possible when good people refuse to stay silent. Ethan Carter lost years of his life to a system that failed him, but he didn't let it define him. He chose to fight not just for himself, but for others like him. That is resilience. That is hope. No matter our age, we all have a role to play. We can ask questions. We can demand accountability. And we can stand for what is right even when it is difficult. Because justice is not just a concept. It is a responsibility. The fight for justice is never easy, but it is always worth it. Judge Cole and Ethan Carter's story proves that truth can prevail, even in the face of corruption. It takes courage, persistence, and the willingness to stand up for what's right. If this story moved you, leave a like and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of resilience, justice, and redemption.